years, mostly in areas outside of like AI security, but with some amount inside AI security. And we have a bunch of other excellent funders who are going to introduce themselves. Hopefully they work.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. So my name is Abbey Chaver. I work at Coefficient Giving, which was previously called Open Philanthropy. We do about half funding on catastrophic risks, so mostly AI risk, but also some sort of bio risk. And we're on track to give $1 billion this year. So we do a lot of funding towards like research, towards nonprofits that are trying to build sort of the workforce to work on transformative AI. And so I'm here to kind of learn more about the kinds of projects we might want to do in information security and AI risk, and learn more about people who are excited to do that kind of research.
I'm Ross Matican, and I work at Halcyon Ventures. We are an AI security and societal resilience funding apparatus is how I would put it, because we started as a field building organization making career transition grants to really excellent researchers and entrepreneurs who are sort of pre-idea and figuring out what to do next and how to get it off the ground. Then we started a venture fund, and we make really investments at the earliest stages in pre-seed, seed, occasionally opportunistically in Series A. We do a lot in pen testing, vulnerability remediation. I'm realizing this is going to come up later, so I'll pause there.
And hi, everyone. Yonatan. I work at a classic venture capital firm, so I don't know if that makes me out of place here a little bit, but I work for a firm called TLV Partners. We are a local generalist early stage firm. We manage about 1.5 billion, been around since 2015, and we invest sort of really across the board as long as there's an Israeli founder involved. And of course, especially over the last couple of years, that means a lot of investments at the intersection of security and AI, but then also in just security and in just AI.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so my first question, like I come from the like sort of philanthropy side, as does Abbey. I guess Ross is like somewhere in between, and we have like typical classic VC fund. You're very welcome here. I'm actually very excited to have more like regular VCs around. So yeah, obviously there'll be people. Hopefully there are people here who are like have like companies or nonprofits or are thinking of starting companies or nonprofits. Yeah, I'm pretty curious as to how, I mean, this is one that like most people can like pitch in on, how you think about like, you know, what should the like philanthropists own, what should like the VCs and the startups and the sort of commercial ecosystem own. Maybe there's overlap, but just sort of just interested for like general takes, like where you guys sort of see your like edge or like the sort of thing that's important that like your sector is like bringing to the space. I think there are two.
I can start. Okay, so I think whenever the market can take on these problems, like we're thrilled because the market can scale. The market is meant to sort of like adopt fast to what customers need. We always think that this is a good strategy. The only challenge comes when you think that a problem is unsolved by the market, right? And we do think that within AI security, there are some problems that don't yet have enough recognition. There's either not regulation that sort of like requires a particular precaution, or people aren't really familiar enough with the threat model, that the market is not going to fill that gap. And so what we try to do is identify what are those gaps, and especially for research that maybe takes a couple of years, takes a while to come to fruition, we hope that there will be a market in a couple of years, but we want to make sure that people are starting to think about these problems now. And so we love being pitched on research projects or sort of nonprofit organizations that are trying to identify those gaps. We want people to do things that are necessary but are not going to be filled by the market in the short term.
Yeah, I think for us, a lot of it comes down to whether or not it can be sold, at least in the near to medium term, on the venture side for us. So what that typically looks like is some degree of market validation of the ability to pilot, ideally with very sophisticated AI native customers like the labs, but not just them. I think a common misconception with frontier AI security and even sort of alignment startups broadly, that the supportive infrastructure is like, well, if it can sell to Anthropic and OpenAI, that must be a great market. And no, that's for us not enough. We want to see businesses that can ideally be sold to some of the biggest enterprises, to highly regulated sectors and spaces like that. We often see and make grants on the nonprofit side for things that involve policy research, standard setting. There's a lot in evals that needs to happen and is perhaps societally beneficial, but not super commercially applicable. That's typically where we write grants.
Well, I think like I'll bring a tiny bit of a different perspective in the sense that, first of all, I think we're not really sure sort of what today is relevant for either or of the models. And I think that neither is the market. I think lines have clearly been blurred by the fact that we're even calling these organizations labs like OpenAI and Anthropic. That does not usually mean that they are startups, right? Usually the word lab refers to something in academia, maybe sort of an NGO, whatever it might be. So I think, first of all, the entire ecosystem has confused a little bit of sort of what's relevant for each. And what I will say is our perspective, though, is actually way more on the founder mindset as opposed to the actual research topic or categorization of where the company operates. And so if what's most interesting to the people that we're speaking with is the research aspect of it, that they specifically want to get as deep in the rabbit hole as they possibly can to advance the research of a specific area, but aren't necessarily thinking about economic value creation, building a large team, creating jobs, that's fantastic, but probably less relevant for a venture capital investment and way more relevant for somebody here on my left.
Yeah, I guess like one thing I'm curious about is I think this is probably true at like many philanthropic endeavors, but particularly at coefficient giving. I feel like the staff there like actually want people to like implement the like research that people come up with. It's sort of like, it was pretty much pointless if it didn't actually lead to like something happening differently in the world. So yeah, I'm curious if you have thoughts on like one way that startups like might have an edge here is they're just like quite beholden to users, and they're just like kind of like they will die if they don't like ship a product and get people to use the product. And like VCs, well, I'm not a VC, but my impression is that like they just care a lot about like customers and the thing being used and like having like getting to revenue quickly and that kind of thing. And that like sort of kill function might not exist with like nonprofit. So I'm curious if you have takes on like given that we sort of want to implement things, we want it to be implemented like relatively quickly. Where is the like, where do you hope that sort of like desire or drive or thing comes from?
Yeah. Well, I think I wouldn't put everything into that bucket. I think there is sort of like fundamental research that sometimes if it's not happening, we do want to make sure that, there is funding opportunities for things that are not immediately marketable. I think our like dream scenario is that we, are able to fund somebody to do research and that creates a market, right? They demonstrate that something can be sold. Sometimes this has to happen through sort of a regulatory angle where just demonstrating that something is possible to regulators makes it possible for them to say, okay, now this is required. So we think this is super relevant for security where a lot of legislators, they just don't really understand security problems very well. But if you can communicate to them, like, here is a relatively cheap way to, introduce a very strong security precaution, let's put it into regulation. We think that that's like one possible angle where after you've done that, now you've created a clear market that the market can just like take over. You don't need to have nonprofit funding anymore. So this is like a lever that we're really excited about.
I'll actually just push back a little bit sort of on the question. I think that today, if you actually look at some of the most sort of high profile fundraisers, you can look at SSI, you can look at Thinking Machines. Like these aren't necessarily companies that have like a direct path towards commercialization, revenue. Even OpenAI, maybe Anthropic a little bit more, but didn't have like clear path to revenue from day one when they were raising money. Those two, OpenAI and Anthropic, have clearly proven that those will be good financial outcomes for their investors. SSI, Thinking Machines, and a few others, let's see. So I'm not necessarily advocating that VC should be doing this more often. But I think that VCs, again, sort of like we are more open, and I'm speaking for the whole category because I know all the VCs in the world, of course, but I think we are more open to understanding, okay, if there's a talent density focused on a very specific area that's going to advance research, perhaps the business models will appear, which is sort of like what Ilya said on Dwarkesh's podcast a few weeks ago, like they will present themselves, which is not something that I recommend to anybody in the audience to tell a VC if you're pitching them, but it's something that I think we're more open to these days.
Yeah, I'm actually quite confused about this. Like, to what degree does this actually apply for like Ilya? One of the like most cited like AI scientists of like all time was, I believe, in like an OpenAI co-founder, just clearly like a very impressive person. Which means that, which in my view, like means he can go out and raise like absurd amounts of money without like a super public plan, and can sort of just go and do that. But like, to what degree does that apply like mostly to OpenAI co-founders? Who are like leaving to start competitor the real like legible sort of elite, or like to what degree could Ilya have raised like 5x more money by like doing something with more like immediate commercial applications?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I think it's a spectrum. I think if we take it more towards the Israeli security ecosystem that exists just a few magnitudes lower. I think there are specific people in the ecosystem that I'm sure many people here in the audience know who can pretty much raise any type of initial seed funding up to $50 million with no idea, no direction because of their previous expertise, which is sort of a different way of talking about Ilya and his background as well, right? And so as venture investors, at the end of the day, especially when we're talking about seed, pre-seed rounds, the only thing we have to go on is the people that are sitting in front of us, right? Investing in markets because you have a deep opinion on the market, usually as an investor, that's a massive trap because we're just not smart enough to do that. We're just not on the ground actually building the technology ourselves. And so if you're focused on the people, then the way to underwrite an opportunity is what has this individual or this team of individuals done in the past? And if they are impressive enough, then yeah, Ilya probably could have raised 5x more, even if he didn't have a business plan, which it seems like he didn't, but either way, yeah.
I think I would also add on this point that there's sort of, I don't know if I should narrow it to two founder archetypes in particular, but I'll introduce that we see a lot and think a lot about. One is the exited entrepreneur who's built and scaled something before in a for-profit sense, and there's also the really sophisticated frontier researcher. I also think that a lot of these sort of lab-type businesses that we get a lot of buzz and excitement about have introduced the research and product company model that we're definitely excited about, not just in frontier AI in terms of building new models for all kinds of use cases, but particularly in security too. I think we want to see more proprietary model architectures, but also in a way, or at least with some sort of co-founder who has a revenue history. And it's quite tricky on this front because we see some companies where we're super moved by the research background, and it's hard to disagree that there's not something strong there. But as investors like to say, we need to be able to get there on go-to-market. And so it's a big consideration.
Yeah, that actually takes us very nicely to my next question. I think you guys have somewhat answered this already, but it might be good to sort of reiterate or just double click on it. Yeah, my guess is that there are a bunch of people here, and some will come from academia or nonprofit sort of space, and others will come from more of a commercial background. And it's plausible to me that they should cross over and be raising money from the other side, or start a project sort of on the other side, depending on what they think is sort of most useful to do. I would love for you to just give a yeah, I mean, we talked about Ilya. My guess is that there aren't 100 Ilyas here, but just knowing the level of ambition, if you're sort of starting out, you sort of have an MVP maybe, or you've been working for a few weekends and you're okay, cool. I think this is exciting. I think this could be a company. I haven't done this before. What is the sort of level of ambition that you should be operating when you try and raise your pre-seed or seed, and what kinds of factors influence that? Obviously this is well, it depends on the person, so feel free to pick what you sort of see as an archetype and talk about that. And then I guess on the philanthropic side, and then maybe after that on the sort of philanthropic side, super keen for what your advice on well, if you're starting out $100K, $1 million, or whatever is appropriate for a certain kind of person.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm going to answer your question as directly as I can, but what I'll say is I'm going to answer in cliches also because I'm a VC and that's what we do. But look, I think that what founders really need to ask themselves and be honest with themselves are they the best in the world at what they're trying to do? Because if you're not, just the fact of the matter is you're just not going to succeed. The statistics are so against you. We are professional, well-paid individuals who are supposed to choose very selectively to invest in about 5 to 10 companies a year. And we get it wrong 80 to 85% of the time, right? And so to have the hubris to think that you, who are only going to be working on one company, that you are choosing the specific right thing to work on. You're going to get through all the hurdles of what it means to hire a team, to convince customers, to convince partners to work with you, and you are going to get it right when everybody else in the world, if it's a big enough problem, are also going to be trying to do the same thing and might be better funded than you. The only way that you can actually answer that question correctly is one, naivete, which is also a good thing, but also to be honest with yourself that, are you one of the best people to do this in the entire world? And the vast majority of the companies that we meet, the answer to that is not yes. We still invest sometimes, but that's neither here nor there. But we really do try to be very honest also with ourselves as investors, that you need to be able to answer yes to that question. And I think that there's too much romanticism, specifically in Israel, around starting a company. I think working at a company is awesome. Especially working at an early stage company is amazing. There are so many things that you can feel proud of, that you can get sort of that thrill and that dopamine hit to be part of creating something from nothing. That doesn't require you to start your own company when you don't actually have the real reasons to do so. So maybe you don't usually hear VCs trying to discourage entrepreneurship, but here you go.
Oh, and maybe, I guess there are like, normally when I say startup, I'm thinking like aggressive growth, trying to like 5x headcount every year or something like this, like raising, like seed, series, seed, series A, series B, craziness. There are also other types of companies one can start that do take investment, and sometimes I would group those in with startups, and maybe it's like, yeah, my guess is you wouldn't say that like to start any company at all that isn't growing aggressively, you have to be like the best person in the world.
For sure. Specifically talking about like the venture model where, again, I wouldn't necessarily use the proxy of, trying to raise as much money and trying to hire as many people, but you're trying to get an outcome in the billions of dollars of market cap, whether that's through an acquisition or through a public offering. And that just goes back to the math that we as VCs have. We raise a certain amount of capital, we're expected to return, 3 to 5x that within a certain time frame, and that only works if the outcomes are a certain size. And so yes, exactly. You go start other companies for sure, but yeah.
It's really hard to look at an investment partner you're working with and a founder in front of you and evaluate, can this idea from zero potentially go to billions of dollars? It's like a lot of mental gymnastics and a lot of luck. So I don't have a great answer there, as much as sort of really taking it stage by stage, but trying to de-risk as much as possible. What I would like to say, particularly for people thinking about starting something at the earliest stages, I don't know if my bar is too high on this front with what kind of traction to expect, but I really, and I know at Halcyon, we really like to see some degree of pilots and design partnerships that are compelling and attractive, and that usually means more than one, and with really large logos. So, I think if we're doing like a good, better, best approach, like okay is like maybe a little bit of revenue with a partnership with even Anthropic or OpenAI or working with a Fortune 500 or something like that. I think better toward best is when we see an entrepreneur come in and they have like 6 to 10 working pilots, and I'm talking super early. Like we really like to see, even if it's pre-seed, we look at companies where it's a great idea, and then we also see pre-seed deals where they've got a functional UI and starting to see some ROI even, like there's actual gains for people that are testing the product. That's super important for us. And so to the extent that we can see more of that at the earliest stages, especially as AI-assisted coding makes it possible to spin up really strong front and back end, that's pretty important. So I would say 6 to 10 plus logos is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think sort of like echoing your point, I think it's just really hard to build something that people want. I guess my previous life was as a product manager, and like it's just really hard. So I think if you have an amazing idea and you really think it's a scalable product, like that is amazing. But I do agree that like building a services company is something that I think a lot of people in this room can like do something very valuable with. And in general, like thinking about how can you build something that is adoptable? I really like your point about design partners. I think that's something that we love to see even with nonprofits. Like Caleb said, if you put out research but it never gets adopted, it just doesn't really make a very big difference. So we do really like to see that sort of like back and forth with the labs, I guess specifically focusing on.
Actually, could you just say what like a design partner, like what that relationship looks like?
Absolutely, yeah. So a design partner would be, you don't necessarily have a prototype. Maybe you have some kind of concept or something, but you're sort of co-designing and co-implementing this with your customer. So this is a customer that is, working with you because you have a particular kind of expertise that they don't have a lot of in-house, or maybe they just don't really have the focus to kind of like work with you on this. But they're sort of outsourcing some of their needs to you as like sort of the services company initially. And eventually you may be able to come up with a product that's scalable and can be sold to other multiple customers. I think it it can be hard with labs because they have very bespoke training environments, so it's not always very easy to sort of like resell different kinds of products. And then of course there's not that many of them. They are operating at huge scale, so like if you have something that's operating at the compute level, then maybe you can scale it up. But I think it is kind of a difficult market to sell just to them.
I want to give the anti-design partner perspective for a second. Look, I think especially sort of in the world of AI security, apropos, I think design partnerships are actually really dangerous for a few reasons. One, I think a lot of the large labs are essentially looking for outsourced engineering teams so that they don't have to fully hire teams internally to do it. They can just say, oh, here's a few talented people. Let me tell you what our needs are. Go work on it. Prove it that maybe there's something interesting. If it's not interesting, it didn't cost them anything, literally a few hours of their time. And if it was interesting, they're not going to start working with you. They're just going to start building it internally themselves, maybe offer you a small acquisition that won't be sort of as interesting as maybe you were expecting to, sort of as these early founders. So one is we're actually not massive proponents of design partners early on. That's from like the founder perspective, how to think of, should you be getting design partners? Do you absolutely need to? I think from the investor perspective also, and this is of course just our perspective, I think design partnerships are also like mental traps for investors. Like if you have 3 or 4 design partners or even 6 to 10, I would say that that's still so not representative of your ability to build a company that for me to put like real significance behind the fact that you convinced 6 people to sign an LOI, like that just doesn't mean really anything. So like I think we actually don't really care if there's design partners, great. We're not going to not invest because there are design partners, but we also don't mind if there aren't, if you can give a really good explanation. What have you been doing for the last couple of months? Why haven't you spoken to customers? And that's totally fine. So I think like we actually don't put that much weight behind design partnerships or not. The only case where I'd say it's very, very helpful is for the confidence of the founders themselves to know that there is somebody on the other side of the tunnel that maybe actually does want this. But again, if you have the right conviction regardless, you might be naive and maybe nobody wants it, but you might not need that confidence, and so therefore don't speak to design partners.
Yeah, I'm curious if there are cases of people that didn't have like the most like legible to you credentials, and they like did something, and then you're like, wow, this team is awesome. They're like super competent. I guess from my perspective, I think like advisors are cheap. I didn't realize that like letters of intent might also be cheap, but that's like pretty interesting. Like what are some like, and obviously we don't want to share things that are like super hackable, but like what are some like sort of concrete signals that you sort of occasionally see where you're just like, oh wow, this person like might be like pretty investable despite like not having exit, like done like $1 billion exit before, or having some other like very legible credential.
I'm trying to think of like a good anecdote. We usually invest at TLV like before anything. It's usually just a team and a presentation, sort of when we invest. I'm trying to think. Like I think that it's more again like a mindset thing. Like we're looking for the hustle, which doesn't necessarily mean that you have design partners or customers. It can mean that, but it also might mean that I don't know, that you've written 5 to 10 really interesting sort of thought pieces that people recognize you as an authority figure, or that you are building a community around the area of technology that you're operating in, and therefore people recognize you. Like, well, I think what we're looking more for is, are you putting yourself in a position to eventually leverage whatever it is that you're creating? So it's not really a great answer. I apologize.
I think this is actually a great answer. I find it interesting.
I think I would add something about creative co-founder composition. So I'll give an example in our portfolio that I do think we can talk about. It's quite public. So one of our companies is AI Underwriting Company, and they're doing some really fascinating work in figuring out how do we underwrite risks from an insurance standpoint in agentic AI in deployment. That team, we've got one co-founder who was one of the earliest go-to-market hires at Anthropic. We've got one co-founder who was like a Canary Wharf McKinsey insurance partner, and then a more technical co-founder from one of the labs as well. And I think that was a really compelling framework where, sure, none of them on their own had $1 billion exit behind them, but they knew how to do the diligence, to speak with customers, and to really work at different points of the early stage entrepreneurial life cycle together in unison. And we're really seeing some exciting early traction from that. So I think that kind of, figuring out what are your strengths and then who can you partner with to really double down and fill some of those gaps where it's hard, it's pretty defensible. Yeah.
Cool. Maybe. I guess it's like the classic question or question area of like, what things are exciting to you? What would you wish people, would work on? What's like at this sort of ideas level? I guess ideas are pretty cheap. So like, curious if there are like things that have been on your mind recently that you sort of just wish people would go and do, or like are kind of confused as to why maybe you're tempted to like leave your current jobs and simply go start that company or nonprofit or whatever. I know that we've been chatting a bit about some stuff. So yeah, maybe you can start with like what's on your mind. What do you wish people would do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been amazing seeing like people starting to flow into this field, especially around red teaming, cyber evaluations. I feel that these fields they're really healthy. I mean, there's a lot of people going into them, and you can actually get paid to do them. Not always as a scalable company, but like certainly as a services org. And so I feel that field's quite healthy and not something that philanthropic funding needs to address. What I feel is less covered is sort of data center security and infrastructure security. And so I know a lot of people here have backgrounds in this, and I personally feel that this is just very underrepresented. A lot of people who currently work in AI risk are coming from ML backgrounds. They're mostly doing research, and so they don't know very much about how a data center is set up. They don't know very much about how you actually secure hardware, and so this is the kind of thing I would love to see more people applying to do research in. If you can figure out a way to do it as a company, that's amazing. But even if you can't, just doing the fundamental research is really, really necessary.
Yeah, I think I would split the answer into categories that we're actively investing in and excited about, and then unresolved problems where I'd love people to come up to me afterwards on this. We're definitely really excited about AI agents used for pen testing and autonomous vulnerability remediation. We really like the idea of automating hacker intuition where possible into proprietary architectures. We're really excited about hardware security, and for us, that looks like secure by design data centers, chip enclosures. I think a sort of hybrid approach. We're very excited about trusted execution environments and confidential inference. We are also very excited about the sort of AI assurance category. So how can you ensure AI risk? Insure against AI risk? How can you create enterprise-grade evals at scale for perhaps highly regulated domains and things of that nature? In terms of big, thorny, unresolved problems, that's really why Halcyon was started and what we're still figuring out. I think the biggest one I would say is critical infrastructure security, particularly against nation-state actors. And I think one of the challenges there is that we'll often get pitches for these kind of comprehensive all-in-one, like we're going to create industrial control systems, security platforms that allow for agentic architectures touching the energy grids and the power plants. And we're also going to have guardrails and compliance and zero knowledge proofs. And it's too much going on at once. It's a bit of a word salad. It's also something that doesn't feel super practical. Is like we don't really see critical infrastructure operators looking for like a vendor of choice as much as looking for a really comprehensive stack for a number of different threat vectors. But to the extent that there's some innovation in the room on that, would love to hear more.
So two quick things from my side. I'd say, look, we're excited in it. We like to invest in people, not ideas, right? My last two investments, one was sort of in the confidential computing sort of private inference stack, and I had never heard of either of them before I met the company. And then the investment before that was a company that's replacing engineers in the construction process. No background in construction myself, had never sort of occurred that problem before. We're excited about people that are passionate about markets and can explain why they're relevant for that specific industry. So if that's defines sort of you or what you're thinking about, then that's potentially relevant for us. One thing that you asked sort of in your question, I actually don't think that ideas are cheap. I think it is one of sort of those sort of things that people say ideas are cheap and it's all about execution. And absolutely, like you cannot build anything of interest without the execution. But I actually think in today's world, the idea is actually super important. And I don't think there are enough unique ideas out there, at least sort of from my vantage point. And it would be great if there were some more unique ideas. I cannot tell you the amount of times that we've heard agent security as a pitch. It's like, honestly, like 10 times this month and probably over 100 times this year in Israel, which makes sense. We Israelis, we like security, woohoo. But like most of those companies aren't going to succeed. It's not really interesting. There's no differentiation. And they're doing it because their friends started a company also, and they feel like they need to be able to tell their friends that they started a company too, which is a really bad reason to start a company. So, yeah.
That's super interesting. I guess like somewhat on the theme of like people like over ideas. I think one thing that coefficient giving does that I would love you to chat a bit about are like sort of career transition like development grants. I think that's like somewhat unusual and would love
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. So a lot of what we try to do is solve for problems that don't have very clear solutions yet, right? We're thinking about like real tail risk kinds of problems or things that are like a bit out in the future where we just don't really know what's going to happen. And so a lot of times we think it makes sense to not be too prescriptive about specific solutions. I mean, we do fund specific solutions, but a lot of the times we just want to create a really intelligent and motivated workforce to think about these problems and develop the solutions, in ways that we cannot foresee. So one of our programs is called Career Development and Transition Funding. And so we look for people that have backgrounds that are really in demand, and cybersecurity is one of them, and hardware is also one of them. And we want to give people funding to take a leave from their job, be able to study or apply for new roles. This could be for school. We will just sort of fund people who we think are very promising to take time to kind of like pivot their career in a direction that we think is very promising. So this is something that you can apply to today. We are really focused on sort of like catastrophic AI risks. So it's not just like any kind of AI security problem. But if you are interested in those problems and you do want to make a career pivot, this is a funding option for you.
Could you just say, like, sort of typical grant size, grant length, just to give people who aren't unfamiliar, like a...
Yes, absolutely. So usually they're about like 3 to 6 months, but sometimes for a really priority project or priority person, it could be like up to a year. And then we usually do sort of like a stipend basis on based on like how much experience you have and sort of like what the typical pay rate would be in your location. So we want you to be able to like live comfortably. We might not be able to match your salary depending on sort of like what stage you're at, but we do want you to just have this time to kind of take this career sabbatical to figure out what you want to do, and we don't want you to be super pressed for cash. So it should be something that you should be able to live on.
Can I ask quickly, have you done that with anybody in Israel yet?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I would be surprised if we hadn't had at least one Israeli, but hopefully we'll get some applications from this conference.
Yeah, I definitely think that if you're like, you're at a job and you're kind of interested in like doing another thing, focus on like catastrophic risks from AI using like cybersecurity, or you have like a hardware background or a bunch of other things, to be honest. I do think that like having some money to like live is like extremely useful for exploring ideas and making better career decisions. You also don't need to, at least my understanding is, you don't need to go and start a company afterwards or a nonprofit afterwards. You can like, there are plenty of good companies to join. And yeah, it's sort of money to like, figure things out and explore things. Yeah, I don't know. It kind of blew my mind when I heard that this like kind of program existed, or like, yeah, you can sort of get money to think and do things. It's great.
Yeah, feel free to come talk to me if you have questions about it.
Yeah, so I'm not from Israel, and my guess is I'm missing like lots of context about how like the sort of startup ecosystem and AI security, safety, like communities work here. Yesterday, someone actually said that like a grant that I gave them like a number of years ago was like super helpful for their like interpretability and like safety community to sort of like get going. And it seems like they've had a lot of success since then. And I embarrassingly was just like completely unaware that this had been like very useful for this person. Yeah, Yonatan, I'm sort of curious for like your take on what sort of like what's the sort of like state of like infrastructure for people starting like ambitious things like here? I mean, my guess is many people here will like already be familiar, but like from like your sort of VC perspective, are there like, oh man, I wish someone would like run like this kind of event. Like we're having this problem at my firm. Like the intersection of like this problem and the AI security stuff would be like, this platform or. Yeah, obviously pretty broad, but yeah, keen for.
Yeah, so I think like from a top-down perspective, like Israel, for probably most of you know, but has the most venture capitalists per capita of any country in the world, right? So like there's plenty of opportunities to raise venture funding if that's what you're interested in doing. But I think like you're asking more about sort of like the infrastructure around helping people start companies. And from that perspective, I think there are a few very successful, like I don't want to call them incubators, but sort of these venture builder platforms in Israel. Very much those specifically focus on security is sort of one of the areas in traditional cybersecurity, I would say. And then there are a few in fintech as well, but it's specifically those two categories. I think the thing that's most missing in the marketplace today, and there is somebody in the audience who's doing this, I just don't know if he's actually in the session right now, is building something very, very similar for the worlds of AI infrastructure specifically. So not AI as an entire category, they're not going to build vertical applications or horizontal applications, but very, very specifically focused on building infrastructure to support the future development of AI across industries. It can be security, it can be inference optimization, it could be safety, whatever it might be. I think that is currently missing in the local ecosystem, and there are two groups groups that are trying to solve that are very much sort of just getting off the ground now. But maybe we can tell you guys about them, and next year they can present also. So
yeah, that sounds great. I was wondering if you could say like what might some like week-to-week activities for such a project like look like? Like what are they sort of concretely?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's a good question. I think they're defining it. I think everyone here in Israel sort of really just looks at what has worked in cyber, because it really has turned into sort of the industrialization of creating cybersecurity companies. Israel has figured that out, and they really have. I think Wiz is a product of that, by the way, right? Of course, not only the founders were incredible as well, not trying to insult anybody, so I think everyone's sort of taking the lessons from what's worked in cybersecurity and trying to apply that to AI, which in some cases might work, in some cases might not. What's one of the cases where it might not work? The CISO is somebody that is repetitive, the same exact persona across enterprises. If any of you have tried to speak to organizations about who's leading their AI efforts, that can be incredibly different depending on the organization. Certain people will, be in charge of the internal usage of AI, but not actually in terms of deploying new AI tools, and that's a problem. But I think what the week-to-week really does look like, it's, hey, let's take people from academia, let's take people from enterprise, and let's just make sure that these early-stage founders have the ability to be exposed to what their problems are on a day-to-day basis, what the biggest problems that they're thinking of are, and potentially how do you translate that into a product, which is not easy, of course. But I think that's what the day-to-day is. Just take people, from the enterprise, from academia, push them together, and hopefully create a startup baby out of that.
I would also add, just from the Bay Area perspective on our excitement about breaking into the Israeli market and really supporting here. I think for a few years there was a lot of excitement, perhaps in a Venn diagram, but not quite in the same room, around this idea of making AI safe and making AI secure. And I think increasingly, as there are wars on multiple fronts worldwide, including one very recent one right over here, there's been a big sort of geopolitical shift toward defense. In the United States, we're talking about this notion of American dynamism and really supporting liberal values and the West, and how do we kind of safeguard democracies. And those are really big existential questions that require a certain sort of founder orientation, military exposure, and an understanding of how some of the big sort of catastrophic or existential type risks intersect with some of the really pragmatic, near-term, ongoing, thorny geopolitical problems too. And so to the extent that there's people in the room that both are excited about the frontiers of AI and how some of these models are performing and creating new capabilities that we've never seen before, and aligning that with a lot of really important kind of pragmatic security and defense concerns, that's super top of mind for us.
Yeah, that's super great. Cool. I think we've worked through a bunch of my pre-prepared questions. So it's been a bit of a mix, but we're onto more unexplored territory in terms of what I prepared you for. I guess like one thing that's been on my mind recently, I think like Halcyon has maybe published a report kind of on this that I haven't read, but maybe I'll have extremely good answers. Is that when I talk to founders and they're like interested in like nonprofits, for-profits, something else, personal projects. One thing that they feel some like angst towards about taking VC funding is like the sort of corporate incentives and how they like really want to go out and save the world or solve some thorny security issue, and they've sort of identified a market and some customers, but they're not sure whether the customer really cares about the the sort of deep tech bottom line in the way that the founders really care about it. That sort of sometimes pushes them, at least in my experience, asking me for money as a philanthropic funder, and sometimes I'm just like, oh man, it really feels like as you were saying, the market should just solve this. I'm curious. I would guess a lot of your sort of mission aligned companies have face this problem. So we'd be keen for you to say some words to that. So or what the playbook would look like, and then Yonatan, I would also be keen for. I mean, maybe insofar as you want to push back on what Ross says, that would be pretty interesting, or give the sort of less socially minded perspective.
I'll give you material to respond to. I think that this notion of the mission-driven founder has unfortunately been a bit tarnished in institutional investment circles because it is sometimes associated with a sacrifice of commercial scale. and sort of, are you building something that may kind of make some money but is good for society versus something that is going to sell like wildfire, but what is the sort of pro-social impact, and should we be thinking about that in a venture capital underwriting context? I think the really cool thing about the Halcyon structure for us is that we are sort of problem first, tool agnostic is how we talk about it, because we are a venture fund that reports into a 501c3 nonprofit. And what that means is that we have the ability to write grants for nonprofits. We also have the ability to write venture checks and partner with great institutional funds. To your question, Caleb, a lot of times we try to look for founders who really want to secure model weights, want to secure the free world from authoritarian regimes, and really kind of important problems that I think a lot in this room are thinking about as well. There's often a concern around, how will commercial pressures, if at all, challenge that mission? Will we have to kind of make pivots we don't want to? Will we have to take capital at a certain point from investors who might push us in a little bit of a different direction than how we kind of started out on this mission? We recently commissioned a big research report on mission preservation governance mechanisms for startups. So a bit of a word salad there, but basically, how can you construct board measures at the earliest stages? How can you create or incorporate in a way that advances your goal and is right? And sometimes we see projects that start as nonprofit and find a way to convert to nonprofit. But oftentimes, and as we see with a lot of case studies out there in the wild, there are examples of certain types of board structures, of minority voting rights and blocks and provisions like that. There's Meta's oversight board, there's Anthropic's long-term benefit trust. There's a number of mechanisms, and there isn't one kind of clear-cut way. But increasingly, as some of these really large enterprises are faced with real kind of society-facing externalities, we think it's important to think about governance from the earliest stages, and it's a big part of how we engage is advising on that front.
Yeah, look, I'll just say that, we just don't spend that much time thinking about it, to be completely honest with you. Like, we are absolutely capitalist first. We are trying to make money for our investors, for ourselves, and for our founders, right? It's hopefully a win-win-win scenario. That being said, I think with to steal a line from Uncle Ben, with great capital comes great responsibility, right? Like, it's not that we are looking to invest in anything that simply makes money. There are investors who do that, and all power to them. Again, this is a capitalist society, and therefore that's okay. But for example, at TLV, there are certain things that we won't touch. We will not, I'm not even talking about pornography, which of course I think there are very few investors that will touch that. But even at TLV, I think we're a little bit unique in Israel. We will not invest in gaming. Not because we think that gaming is inherently bad for society, but it doesn't make us feel good getting out of bed every morning, knowing that we are, giving people a reason to waste their time that could be allocated in more productive ways, right? So we won't do gaming. There are plenty of other funds that will do it. And does it make us feel better when we invest in something that has to do with healthcare? Of course it does. But at the end of the day, sort of what drives our decisions is, does this have a path towards returning capital to our investors? And if the answer to that is yes, then we're probably going to invest, as long as it's not actively doing destructive things to society.
Great. So I think we're out of time. But yeah, thank you so much for attending the panel. Thank you so much, panel participants. Yeah, I'm sure that they'll be around to chat, and would love you to potentially pitch, apply to them for funding, or engage with them in some way. Even if they wouldn't love it, I would love it if you would do that anyway. Yeah, please join me in giving them a round of applause.